This is the third of 3 videos about the wrecks of the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse, and their combined loss in one mass attack by 85 Japanese planes in the South China Sea on 10 December 1941, whilst operating as Force Z almost 200 miles north of Singapore. The loss to air attack of the brand new fast battleship Prince of Wales, whilst underway in the open sea, is seen as defining the end of the era of the battleship. The first video in this series concentrated on the deployment of Prince of Wales and Repulse to Singapore and the fateful sortie of Force Z from Singapore after Japanese landings had taken place in northern Malaya and southern peninsular Thailand, almost simultaneously with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941. The second video focused on the battle from the perspective of the Prince of Wales and covered her subsequent wreck in the seabed. This video will focus on the battle from the perspective of the Repulse and will cover her wreck. If you are new to my channel, then to set the scene and understand the battle in depth, check out the first 2 videos in this trilogy, as there will be a lot in those that I won't repeat again in this third video. By way of background, I took part in a number of expeditions to dive both Prince of Wales and Repulse in the early 2000s. My interest in these wrecks led me to publish my own book, Force Z, Shipwrecks of the South China Sea, in 2013. Since then, however, despite being 2 British war graves and the last resting place for 840 Royal Navy personnel who were killed in the battle, these 2 wrecks have been subjected to intensive illegal salvage work, as have a number of other British, Dutch and American World War II war graves in the area. The wrecks of Prince of Wales and Repulse have now both been greatly damaged by salvage work, while some of the other naval war graves in the area have been completely dismantled and removed, all for their precious pre-Hiroshima steel and non-ferrous metals, or, allegedly, to remove any large wrecks from the South China Sea beside which an enemy submarine could lie hidden. My aim with these 3 videos is to record, for posterity, what the 2 wrecks were like before this awful salvage work started. Repulse was one of 2 British renowned-class battlecruisers constructed for the Royal Navy during the First World War, her keel being laid down at John Brown's shipyard on the River Clyde, Glasgow, on 25 January 1915. Repulse was launched for fitting out afloat almost exactly 1 year later, on 8 January 1916. She was commissioned into the Royal Navy on 18 August 1916, just a couple of months after the famous Battle of Jutland. At 794 feet long, with a beam of 90 feet and displacing 31,590 long tons full load, she was a fine addition to the British Grand Fleet. Driven by 42 boilers and 4 sets of steam turbines, her 4 propellers could drive her to 32 knots, much faster than the 21-knot dreadnought battleships of the day. To gain this great speed, Repulse had been designed with just a 6-inch thick vertical waterline armour belt, compared to the 14-inch thick belts of the dreadnought battleships. She carried 6 of the latest breech-loading 15-inch 42 cal Mark I main battery guns, which had just begun to be fitted to British battleships and battlecruisers, again saving weight on the dreadnought battleships, which carried 4 or 5 such twin-gun turrets. The 15-inch gun was the most successful heavy gun to be used by the Royal Navy and would remain in service until 1959. These 6 fearsome 15-inch guns were set in 3 hydraulically operated 2-gun turrets. 1 pair of turrets was set towards the bow in front of the bridge superstructure. In the Royal Navy, the foremost turret was called A turret, whilst the superfiring B turret was immediately abaft. Y turret was set towards the stern. As built, the secondary battery of Repulse comprised 17 breech-loading 4-inch Mark IX guns, installed in 5 triple mounts and 2 single mounts. These were intended to provide rapid concentrated fire against cruisers and lighter warships, but the triple mounts proved clumsy to operate as the guns trained independently and weren't mounted in one sleeve that would allow all 3 to train together. They each had separate breech mechanisms, meaning that the triple mount required a gun crew of 23, and you can imagine the difficulty of coordinating so many bodies in such a tight area. The 4-inch gun was introduced in 1917 as an anti-ship weapon, the mount only allowing the gun to elevate to 30 degrees. It was therefore unsuitable for anti-aircraft work when aircraft became the main threat to warships. Only a light battery of 2 high-angle 3-inch 45 cal 12-pounder mounts was fitted for anti-aircraft work, as attack by aircraft at the time of construction wasn't seen as a significant threat to capital ships. Repulse was also fitted with 2 beam submerged torpedo tubes, one at each side forward of the A-turret barbette, but these tubes became obsolescent and would be removed during a 1937 refit. Repulse's only significant action during World War I was in the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight in 1917, when she took part in a stern chase of withdrawing German warships and scored a hit on the light cruiser Königsberg. The World War I battlecruiser concept of having large main battery guns equal to those of a battleship, fitted in a faster but more lightly armoured battlecruiser that had the speed to catch and kill cruisers and lighter warships, would however prove to be flawed. Whereas the battlecruiser was intended to be the fast arm of the fleet, able to scout ahead and punish lighter opponents, that great speed, allied to the same main battery weapons as the more heavily armoured dreadnought battleships, induced battlecruiser commanders to engage directly with battleships. Tragic consequences would follow at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, when 3 more lightly armoured British battlecruisers were hit and sunk with huge loss of life. With the deficiencies of British battlecruisers so savagely exposed at Jutland, which took place just as Repulse was being completed, extra horizontal armour was added over her magazines and steering gear, and then in 1918-1919 Repulse was reconstructed with her original thin 6-inch waterline armour belt along each beam being replaced by a thicker 9-inch thick belt. The original 6-inch side armour was then fitted between the main and upper decks above the new 9-inch belt. The original small anti-torpedo bulge was deepened and reworked to now cover the hull from the forward submerged torpedo rooms, which were located towards the bow, all the way aft to a abaft Y turret. The inner compartments of the anti-torpedo bulge were filled with crushing tubes that were designed to bend and buckle and dissipate the effects of a torpedo blast before it penetrated to the hull proper. Repulse was a fast modern ship that carried the largest guns in the Royal Navy, and so as the world descended into chaos in the 1930s, she would be brought up to standard for a war with Germany that seemed increasingly likely. Adjustments were made to her secondary battery of 4-inch guns, and a hangar was built on each side of the aft funnel to house 2 Fairey seaplanes, which were catapult launched on a trolley for maritime reconnaissance and spotting the fall of shot. On return, the Fairey seaplane would land on water and then be recovered aboard by crane. 1 extra seaplane could be carried on the deck and another on the catapult itself. By World War II, Repulse would carry the catapult-launched Supermarine Walrus amphibious biplane, whose fully retractable undercarriage allowed it to land on land. The original light anti-aircraft battery of 2 high-angle 3-inch guns was beefed up with the addition of 4 sets of 8-barrel Vickers 2-pounders, nicknamed pom-poms, due to the sound that earlier models made when firing. The 8 barrels were set in 2 rows of 4 guns, and due to the operation of the barrels they came to be known as the Chicago Piano. Vickers Mark II machine guns were fitted above, but these had a limited range of only 800 yards. A further strengthening of our anti-aircraft defences was planned, but hadn't been carried out by the time war broke out, and so Repulse entered World War II with acknowledged poor anti-aircraft defences. When Germany invaded Poland and triggered World War II in September 1939, Repulse was initially engaged in the North Sea, searching for German ships running the British naval blockade, before she supported Allied operations during the Norway campaign from April to June 1940. Captain William Tennant assumed command on 28 June 1940. He had just won great respect and praise for overseeing the successful evacuation of some 300,000 troops from the beaches of Dunkirk the month before, remaining ashore right up until the last ships had left the beaches on 2nd June. He famously patrolled the beaches with a megaphone calling and searching for British troops, and earning the nickname Dunkirk Joe to sailors under his command. From July 1940 until May 1941, under Captain Tennant's command, Repulse carried out Atlantic convoy escort duties until she was diverted in late May 1941 to take part in the hunt for the Bismarck, which had broken out into the Atlantic with the Prince Eugen to terrorise Allied convoys. Repulse had to break off her part in the search early, when she began to run low on fuel. Repulse was then again refitted between June and August, when she received 6 Oerlikon 20mm rapid-fire anti-aircraft weapons, as well as a surface gunnery radar to add to her 2 high-angle control system anti-aircraft directors, which were situated one in the foretop and one on a pedestal above the rear superstructure. In October 1941, just over 2 months before the famous Japanese surprise raid in Pearl Harbor, to deter the threatened Japanese invasion of Thailand, Malaya and Singapore, Churchill determined to send a small but powerful naval squadron to Singapore, ships that could catch and kill any enemy ship. The brand new King George V class battleship Prince of Wales, with a top speed of 28 knots and carrying 10 14-inch main battery guns, was selected as flagship for the squadron, which would also include Repulse, which was by then operating in the Indian Ocean. Despite her weak anti-aircraft suite, Repulse was ordered to rendezvous at Colombo, Ceylon, with Prince of Wales, which was en route from Britain to Singapore in Force G. The small, powerful squadron of the two capital ships, Prince of Wales and Repulse, would be commanded from Prince of Wales by Admiral Sir Tom Phillips and would have an escort of 4 destroyers, whilst the aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable would be attached to the squadron to provide fleet air defence, which would be augmented by RAF planes based throughout Malaya. Prince of Wales was the latest in British battleship construction, having just been completed a few months earlier in May 1941. Her main battery of 10 14-inch guns were set in 2 quad turrets, A and Y, with a super-firing twin B turret just abaft A turret in front of the bridge superstructure. These guns had a range of almost 22 miles and offered a broadside salvo of 10 14-inch shells every 40 seconds. Unlike Repulse, Prince of Wales carried the latest anti-aircraft weapons, including 16 quick-firing 5.25-inch dual-purpose guns set in 4 twin turrets on each side of the superstructure. These were the heaviest dual-purpose guns used by the Royal Navy in World War II, with a range of almost 14 miles and an upper limit for anti-aircraft use of 49,000 feet, higher than most of today's jets fly at. Prince of Wales also carried an anti-aircraft battery of 6 sets of the 8-barrel quick-firing 2-pounder Vickers pom-pom guns, as fitted on Repulse, a single Bofors 40mm autocannon on the quarterdeck, a number of rapid-fire 20mm Oerlikon light cannons, which would subsequently prove to have limited stopping power, Lewis machine guns, and 80 unrotated projectiles, an ingenious short-range rocket-firing anti-aircraft weapon which deployed a mine suspended on a wire from 3 parachutes in front of an approaching aircraft. When the aircraft hit the wire, the mine would be dragged up into contact with the plane. Led by Prince of Wales, Force G arrived at Singapore on 2nd December 1941 and, in a show of force to reassure the population, sailed around Singapore Island and then up the Johor Strait before entering the naval dockyard to a rapturous welcome. My family were living in Singapore at the time and would have been aware of the fanfare of their arrival. Force G was subsequently redesignated as Force Z. Ominously, the Squadron Air Defence Carrier Indomitable had run aground in Jamaica in November and had to head to a US Navy yard for repair. She would not now be able to reach Singapore in time, and consequently Force Z would be reliant on their own anti-aircraft weaponry and land-based RAF air cover. A squadron of RAF Brewster Buffalo fighters based at Singapore was earmarked for fleet defence of Force Z and would be kept out of any other fighting. But as the British warships arrived to great fanfare in Singapore, no one knew that Japan had already made the decision to go to war with the USA, Britain and Holland, and that Japan's 6-carrier strike force was already halfway across the North Pacific en route to attack Pearl Harbor less than a week later on 7th December 1941. At dawn on 4th December 1941, just 2 days after the British warships arrived in Singapore, Japanese transport ships carrying an invasion force of more than 26,000 troops left ports in China on a 4-day incessant passage bound for landing beaches in southern Thailand and northeast Malaya, such as Singora, Patani and Kota Baru. The Japanese landings began in darkness early on Monday, 8th December, almost simultaneously with the surprise strike on Pearl Harbor. RAF airfields throughout northern Malaya were simultaneously bombed, and by the end of Monday, 8th December, the RAF in northern Malaya had been largely decimated. Through all of this, Prince of Wales and Repulse had lain berthed at Singapore. Faced with reports of multiple beach landings to the north, and with Singapore now being bombed and the RAF devastated in the north, Admiral Phillips sortied Force Z at dusk that evening of Monday, 8th December, hoping that his warships would arrive undetected off the Japanese invasion beaches at Singora at first light, a day and a half later on 10th December. It was hoped that the poor monsoon weather would hide the Sortie to the north, and with the element of surprise, the British ships could then smash the Japanese troop transports and devastate Japanese landing forces ashore with a naval bombardment. However, the next day, Tuesday 9th December, Force Z was spotted heading north by a Japanese submarine, and then just 1 hour before sunset, when darkness would hide Force Z, the monsoon weather broke, the skies cleared, and Force Z was spotted by 3 Japanese snooper planes. With the element of surprise lost, after running north for a few hours in darkness, the raid in Singora was abandoned and Force Z turned to run southwards, initially towards Kota Baru, but then towards Kuantan, halfway down the Malayan Peninsula, when it was reported that Japanese troops were landing there. On Wednesday, 10th December 1941, as nautical dawn arrived and first light crept over the horizon at 5 a.m, Force Z was halfway down the Malayan Peninsula, about 60 miles off Kuantan. All ships went to full action stations, and as dawn arrived, lookouts saw no enemy planes or surface vessels. But an hour and a half later, at 6:30 a.m, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft appeared and began shadowing Force Z. Meanwhile, almost simultaneously, at 5 a.m. in Saigon, 9 Japanese Mitsubishi G-3M long-range reconnaissance bombers, Allied reporting codename Nell, took off and headed south, fanning out to sweep the South China Sea and locate Force Z. At 6:30 a.m, 1.5 hours after the 9 Nell scout planes had taken off, a mixed group of 85 Nell bombers and Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers took off from Saigon. 4 of these large, long-range planes carried either 2 550-pound bombs or a single 1,100-pound bomb. There were no armour-piercing bombs that would cut deeply into the horizontal decks. These were high-explosive bombs intended to devastate the upper works of the British ships and kill or injure gun crews. The remaining 51 long-range bombers carried a single aerial torpedo. The 85 Nell and Betty bombers flew slowly south, maintaining radio silence and waiting for the 9 Nell scout planes far ahead to spot Force Z. The hours ticked past without anything happening, but then at 10:15 a.m, after almost 4 hours of flight, 1 Nell found Force Z and sent back details of the location, heading and strength of the British naval force and provided a directional signal. The 85 Japanese bombers lingering to the north now altered course to head directly for Force Z. In the operations rooms of the Force Z warships, 25 minutes after the Japanese snooper plane had been spotted, the echoes of a formation of aircraft were picked up on radar. A general order was issued by the flagship Prince of Wales: assume first-degree anti-aircraft readiness. As the minutes ticked by, the order was then given: action stations, repel aircraft. The bugler sounded action stations through the tannoy, and gun crews readied for combat at their posts. Just after 11 a.m, within 1 hour of Force Z being spotted, a first squadron of 8 Japanese Nell level bombers came into view of the Force Z warships. Although Prince of Wales was the lead ship, as Force Z sped south towards Singapore, the Japanese decided to attack the second British ship in the line of battle, the Repulse, whose main deck was known to be more thinly armoured than the brand new battleship Prince of Wales. The Japanese planes set it into a tight formation and began their bombing run. On sighting the attacking bombers, both British capital ships ran up the white ensign, the battle ensign, to fore and main masts. Gunnery officers aboard Prince of Wales and Repulse began to plot the range, height and speed, and a signal was then issued: enemy aircraft in sight, range 16,500 yards, height 10,000 feet, speed 200, commence, commence, commence. Information from rangefinders was fed into plotting table calculators, and a stream of fuse-setting calculations was soon being produced for the 5.25-inch secondary turrets on Prince of Wales. By the time it was judged that accurate, reliable ranges had been established and fire could be commenced, the range had reduced to 12,000 yards. On Repulse, the older 4-inch guns opened fire at about 11,000 yards. But as the anti-aircraft gunners opened up, on Prince of Wales, closest to the approaching planes, signal flags were run up, ordering all ships to turn together 30 degrees to starboard towards the approaching enemy planes, which were approaching from the starboard beam. As the turn to starboard began, 4 of the 5.25-inch high-angle mounts on the starboard side of Prince of Wales were able to train and fire on the enemy planes. The anti-aircraft guns were trained under control by the air defence position, the tower control, and aboard both great ships it was immediately noticed that the anti-aircraft shells were exploding to the right of the Japanese bombers, which were not taking any evasive action at all. The swing to starboard was counteracting the tracking corrections to the left being given to the guns by the air defence position, and then as the starboard turn became more pronounced, the guns in the starboard beam of both ships had to cease firing as their superstructures masked the line of fire. The turn to starboard continued, and as the Japanese aircraft came in sight of the port anti-aircraft guns of both ships, they began firing. But just as the port guns began firing, Admiral Phillips signalled all ships to turn 50 degrees to port. The new turn to port now caused the port guns to cease firing, as the superstructures again masked the Japanese planes. For a few moments no anti-aircraft guns at all fired, before the turn to port allowed the starboard guns to begin firing again. These cumbersome fleet manoeuvres by signal flag had robbed the gunnery officers of the opportunity to settle down to a long run of firing that would have enabled accurate corrections to be made and more effective fire to be brought against the unswerving compact formation of Japanese planes. Perhaps realising the difficulties being created, Admiral Phillips now signalled that ship commanders had freedom of movement. But radio silence was still maintained, and no call was made for the squadron of Brewster Buffalo fighters, earmarked for fleet defence, that were sitting on the ground at Singapore, just an hour's flying time away. The 8 Japanese Nell bombers, first to attack, flew almost directly over Prince of Wales as they targeted Repulse in a bombing run, and at about 11:30 am each released one of their 2 550-pound bombs simultaneously from about 10,000 feet in a disciplined pattern. The planes were low enough that British crews could see the bombs leaving the bomb bays and begin to arc down towards Repulse. Repulse is not recorded as taking any evasive action. There was just not enough time to manoeuvre the great ship in the few seconds available. Most of the bombs were near misses that straddled Repulse, creating huge fountains of water that almost completely obscured the ship. First, one fountain erupted on the starboard side, then several more on the port side aft. Of 2 reported hits, one bomb hit Repulse amidships abaft the aftmost number 2 funnel. The bomb penetrated the upper boat deck roof of a Walrus seaplane hangar on the starboard side without exploding, leaving a neat 15-inch diameter hole. The bomb then punched through the unarmoured floor of the seaplane hangar into the Marines' mess below, passing through the mess deck floor before finally exploding when it hit the 1-inch thick horizontal armour deck below, killing and injuring some crew and starting small fires. If the bomb had been an armour-piercing bomb or one of the larger 1,100-pound bombs that other Japanese aircraft were carrying, then the bomb may well have penetrated through the armour deck to explode in one of the boiler rooms below. But as it was, several steam pipes in the boiler room below the armour deck were fractured, either by the shock wave from the explosion or by distortion of the framework supporting the pipes. A number of stokers stationed here below the armour deck were badly scalded, and to escape the steam they climbed up through boiler uptakes and ventilation shafts, only to be blocked from getting topsides onto deck by heavy wire netting. Badly burnt, naked, screaming in agony, and trapped, they called for help. Seeing their predicament, a dozen crew nearby found a rope and hauled the wire net off to allow the stokers to get out. Some other crew had been trapped in a compartment below the catapult deck. But despite this mayhem, Repulse's speed had not been affected, and she steamed on out of the cloud of spray from the near-miss bombs, just trailing a small plume of smoke from the upper deck near the starboard aircraft hangar. A Walrus reconnaissance seaplane had been knocked off its catapult trolley, and when it began leaking aviation fuel over the deck, the Walrus was hooked onto a crane and swung out over the side of the ship and dropped into the sea. In this famous archive photo taken from a Japanese plane, Repulse at bottom left is straddled by near misses. I can count the white splashes of 7 of the near misses, and the 8th bomb was the one that hit Repulse aft. The Prince of Wales is at the top right of the photograph. She's moving at speed. Her wake reveals a turn to port, followed by a pronounced turn to starboard. Given that the ships are heading broadly south, the plume of smoke coming from Prince of Wales smokestacks shows that it was a south-southeast wind on the day. With the first bombing wave over, Force Z resumed steaming south towards Singapore, but within minutes radar in Prince of Wales picked up an even larger force of planes approaching from the southeast. At this point, with complete radio silence still being maintained, no one in Singapore knew where Force Z was, or that it was under heavy air attack. At 11:38, after 5 hours of flight from Saigon, 17 Japanese high-level bombers and 50 torpedo bombers were close enough to begin their attack from about 8 miles away. As they began their attack, they split up to make simultaneous bombing and torpedo attacks on both Prince of Wales and Repulse from different directions, and thus split British anti-aircraft fire. The Nell and Betty bombers flew across the bows of the southbound British ships whilst out of range, before forming up in line astern as they increased speed and began to drop towards Force Z. As the first line of 9 torpedo bombers attacked the port beam of Prince of Wales, all 8 portside 5.25-inch dual-purpose guns in the 4 twin turrets opened fire, to be joined by the Bofors 40mm on the quarterdeck. Then the 4-barreled Chicago piano pom-poms began pumping out their 2-pound shells. Finally, the shorter-range rapid-fire 20mm Ehrlichens and machine guns opened fire. But the gunners were not prepared for the fast speed of 180 miles an hour that the Japanese planes attacked at. They had trained to repel attacks at 100 miles per hour, the speed that the Royal Navy's own Fairey Swordfish biplanes attacked at. Most British shells burst behind the Japanese aircraft as they roared towards the British ships. The torpedo bombers dropped their torpedoes once they were between 1,500 to just 600 metres from the huge port beam of the Prince of Wales. Once the bombers had committed their torpedoes, Captain Leach ordered hard a port to comb the tracks of the torpedoes. But before the crash turn to port could be completed, 2 torpedoes hit Prince of Wales aft, one in the port beam aft, which caused little damage to the side armour belt and torpedo protection system. The second torpedo, however, struck a battleship's Achilles heel, the unarmoured area at the stern, out with the armoured box of the Citadel, where the rudders, propellers and shafts had to be free to operate. This was the critical strike that from this moment on doomed the Prince of Wales. Prince of Wales had 4 propellers, and the torpedo punched a hole in the hull near the bracket struts that supported the free tail section of outboard port prop shaft. Prince of Wales was moving at full speed of 25 knots, and the outboard port propeller was rotating at 204 revolutions per minute, but now damaged, it began turning out of centre and began to vibrate violently, weakening the struts of the support bracket. Fierce vibrations ran along the shaft for 200 feet all the way to B engine room, damaging watertight glands around the shaft in transverse bulkheads, allowing a direct route for water to flood up the prop shaft alley. The violent vibration now sheared the 17.5-inch diameter steel propeller shaft itself, and the suddenly free length of tail propeller shaft, along with the weakened hull bracket and huge propeller, now broke free and fell to the seabed, ripping the internal stern section of shaft out of the hull. Huge volumes of water now poured into the shaft alley and began to search its way to the very heart of the ship, to B engine room, which had to be quickly abandoned. The last man got out and the hatch was dogged down, just as water began to ooze out from it. Worse, as the outboard port propeller, hull bracket and shaft fell away to the seabed, debris entered the port inboard propeller race, damaging its blades in operation and forcing its turbine to be shut down. After just 6 minutes of this attack, both port propellers were now out of action, and Prince of Wales slowed to 15 knots. Captain Tennant had withdrawn Repulse well away to starboard, and was now about a mile south of Prince of Wales. As 7 Nells began a torpedo attack on Repulse, 3 of the escort destroyers formed a circle around her to provide additional anti-aircraft fire. Repulse's second battery of triple and single 4-inch guns opened up, but the 4-inch mounts were old anti-surface ship weapons, not anti-aircraft weapons, and some were trained by hand. Most could not now elevate to high angle to target the planes aloft, whilst others could not depress sufficiently to attack low-flying torpedo aircraft. They made a lot of noise, smoke and flashes, but were of little real use. The rapid-fire 20mm Ehrlichens were more successful, but they had limited stopping power, and hits from the Ehrlichens just went right through the Nell's fuselages. The Japanese were undeterred by the anti-aircraft fire, their planes dropping to just above the water as they began their torpedo runs. Captain Tennant began to make evasive manoeuvres, but as he did so, another squadron of 8 Nells now attacked Repulse. There were now more than 15 Nells engaging the veteran battlecruiser. The Nells dropped their torpedoes from just above the water, and white tracks crisscrossed the calm blue sea, the torpedoes speeding towards Repulse at up to 40 knots. Once they had dropped their torpedoes, the Japanese planes flew down both sides of Repulse, spraying her topsides with machine gun bullets and forcing exposed gun crews to jump for cover. At 25 knots, Captain Tennant waited until each Japanese torpedo plane had committed to the attack. He then put the wheel over to comb the tracks. In this fashion, he skillfully and successfully combed the tracks of some 19 torpedoes, while simultaneously with the torpedo attack, he avoided the 550-pound bombs dropped from 6 high-level bombers at 12,000 feet. Repulse emerged from the smoke of her own gunfire about 3 miles away from Prince of Wales and began to close the flagship, which was now beginning to noticeably list to port to see if help could be given. 25 Japanese torpedo bombers and 8 high-level bombers had now concluded their attacks. 1 had been shot down, 2 had been seriously damaged, and 10 lightly damaged, but 26 torpedo bombers and 17 high-level bombers still remained to attack. Just before 12 noon, an uncanny lull descended. Captain Tennant aboard Repulse was advised that Prince of Wales still had not broken radio silence, but after seeing Prince of Wales beginning to list so badly, Captain Tennant finally broke radio silence and at 11:58 sent a coded transmission to Singapore advising that enemy aircraft were bombing and requesting help. In Singapore, 200 miles to the south, officers were stunned once the signal had been decoded, as this was the first news of Force Z since a signal early in the morning from one of the escort destroyers that had been detached to head south, which had advised that the British ships were returning to Singapore. But now that the perilous state of Force Z had been revealed, the 11 Brewster Buffaloes sitting on the ground at Singapore and earmarked for fleet defence were scrambled. They took off within 5 minutes, but it was already too late. Force Z was 1 hour's flying time away to the north, and they would not arrive until after 1 p.m. The lull ended at 12:19 when another swarm of Japanese aircraft attacked both ships. Whilst Repulse was still in fine fighting form, barring the single bomb hit aft, aboard Prince of Wales, power had failed in the aft part of the ship and the rudder had jammed. The increasing list to port had caused the starboard beam to rise higher. The power-operated anti-aircraft guns could not be trained properly or could not depress sufficiently to hit the 6 torpedo bombers that now attacked the battleship's starboard beam. 3, possibly 4 torpedoes struck Prince of Wales in quick succession on the starboard beam. With Prince of Wales clearly mortally wounded, unable to steer, and with a huge list to port, at 12:23, 20 torpedo bombers now attacked Repulse from all sides, although concentrated to starboard. Captain Tennant began manoeuvring the Repulse at speed again, turning to starboard to comb the tracks of the first batch of 8 torpedoes that were dropped from 2,500 yards. Her guns were firing well. But having seen the manner in which Captain Tennant had combed the tracks of the first earlier wave of torpedoes, 3 Japanese torpedo bombers from a group that was beginning an attack on Prince of Wales had in fact been feinting towards Prince of Wales to disguise their true intentions. They now peeled off from the group attacking Prince of Wales and began an attack run towards Repulse's port side. They dropped their torpedoes. Such was the number of torpedoes in the water simultaneously that it was impossible for Repulse to comb all the tracks. Captain Tennant could do nothing other than continue his starboard turn at 28 knots to comb the tracks of the first group of torpedoes that had been dropped. To do anything else would mean that those torpedoes would hit. Although Repulse avoided all the first 8 torpedoes on the starboard beam, of the 3 torpedoes dropped on her port beam, 1 hit Repulse amidships on her torpedo bulge. A second hit at such an oblique angle that it failed to explode. The third torpedo missed. Water poured into the hole created in the port torpedo bulge, and the great ship began to list. Immediate counterflooding of the starboard compartments was begun to counteract the list. Repulse had still not been mortally wounded. But 9 more Japanese aircraft now began an attack on Repulse, the planes splitting up to attack from different angles in a starfish attack. 6 attempted to get round to Repulse's starboard side, whilst 3 Bettys attacked from port, closing to almost point-blank range at about 600 yards before releasing their torpedoes. Although 1 Betty was able to bank away, the other 2 Bettys could not, and they flew right over Repulse's bow. The Chicago Piano 2-pounder pom-poms took the Bettys under fire. 1 Betty was hit and exploded in a huge ball of fire before crashing. The other Betty, with unprotected wing fuel tanks, lived up to its nickname of the Flying Cigar. It caught fire, and the fire rapidly spread along the fuselage, engulfing the plane and forcing it to crash into the water. All 3 torpedoes from this port attack by the 3 Bettys hit Repulse. One was a hit near the engine room, a second hit abreast the aftmost 15-inch Y turret, whilst the third hit towards the stern, jamming the rudder in the position it had been in as Repulse turned to starboard to comb the tracks of the first group of torpedoes from the starboard side. Repulse could now only steam in a wide circle, and as she did, she was hit by another torpedo on her port side, and then another torpedo hit her on her starboard side alongside E boiler room. In the course of 4 to 5 minutes, Repulse had been hit by another 5 torpedoes. Water poured into her innards, and the port list increased to 7 degrees, then steadily increased to 12 degrees. Captain Tennant knew Repulse had been mortally wounded, and gave the order, "All hands on deck, prepare to abandon ship. God be with you." Below deck, the well-drilled pre-war crew had stood by their action stations during the attacks, but now ordered to get on deck, they donned their life preservers and began to move up from their action stations to get on deck, whilst those crew aloft in the superstructure and top hamper scrambled down ladders. With military discipline, crew began to cut loose the canvas-covered copper and cork Carley floats, the life rafts. The boom boats, the motor boats and whalers, however, that needed power and a level ship, could not be launched quickly, and it is believed that none were used. The 2 escort destroyers, Electra and Vampire, closed Repulse and stood by to rescue survivors. When the ship had taken on a 30-degree list of port, Captain Tennant gave the order, "Abandon ship." On the order being given, although the ship was still going through the water at about 5 knots, men began clambering up the sloping decks to the high starboard guardrail, before climbing over the rail to face an intimidating slide down the starboard side of the ship on their backsides to the sea. There was a large torpedo hole invisible just below the water, and several men were seen to enter the water and then suddenly disappear as they were sucked into the hole, as water surged into the moving ship through the hole. As Repulse listed further to port, the jagged torpedo hole reared out of the water, and the full torpedo bulge appeared. Hundreds of men got away from Repulse in these minutes in orderly fashion. There was no panic, no pushing. Men calmly waited their turn to go down the side of the ship. But the speed of the attacks and the capsize, allied to the speaker system below decks breaking down, resulted in many compartments below not receiving the order to abandon ship. Some crew only realised when the ship began to shudder and quickly heel over. For those crew deep in the ship to get on deck, they had to pass up through several deck levels, through hatches which had been closed and dogged down at action stations when the battle began. These had to be forced open, often against the list of the ship. Many of the decks had lost power and light, and in pitch darkness crew had to feel their way through corridors to find hatches to get through. The heavy armour hatches of the horizontal armour deck were particularly hard to open. Some 100 men were in the engineer's workshop when water began to pour down the 2-foot square escape shaft. In an orderly queue, men waited to get up the shaft, the first men emerging onto the half-deck above to find that they were up to their chests in water. Many would be trapped below. Some men got out onto the high starboard side of the ship through open portholes. But tragically, many men were wounded or trapped in the deepest compartments, such as the magazine, shell handling rooms, boiler and engine rooms. Others were casualties in the sick bay who could not be moved. They had to be left as the ship shuddered and heeled over. Some unfortunate crew successfully reached open portholes, only to be washed back into the ship to their deaths as the portholes submerged and water poured in. Some crew stayed at their anti-aircraft gun posts on the Oerlikon 20mm, continuing to fire at Japanese planes until the ship was practically on its side, some gunners going down with the ship. Suddenly, Repulse gave a great lurch and went right over onto her port beam ends, such that the masts and superstructure appeared to lie flat in the water. Men crowded at the starboard bilge keel at the bottom of the ship, some hesitating to enter the water, whilst others dived in and started swimming for the destroyers. The roll of the ship continued inexorably, the great weight of the gun turrets and superstructure pulling her over. The stern now reared up, the propellers were seen to be still turning, before the stern disappeared beneath the water, the foreship rising high to hang in the air, the red-painted keel visible to the crew in the water. It is likely at this point that the stern had come to rest in the seabed, for Repulse was 3 times longer than the depth of water. The attacks ended at 12:30, and by 12:32, just 11 minutes after the last phase of the attack began, the upside-down bow of Repulse disappeared beneath the waves. The destroyers Electra and Vampire now moved in to start picking up crew from the water. Bodies and debris littered the surface. amongst which crew, mostly covered in black oil with just the whites of their eyes showing, swam towards the Carly floats. But the Repulse had gone down so fast that many of the Carly floats had not been cut loose, and they were taken down with the ship. From a ship's complement of some 1,180 men, 513 perished. Tragically, that's 4 out of every 10 crew that died. How many were trapped below decks? No doubt some in airtight compartments, no one knows. Perhaps some were alive in airtight compartments as the ship capsized, floors becoming ceilings and ceilings becoming floors. Many no doubt felt the impact of the stern hitting the seabed and the slow collapse of the ship until it settled at the bottom of the South China Sea. The remaining Japanese planes now concentrated on the crippled Prince of Wales, and at 1 p.m. the order to abandon Prince of Wales was given. In this iconic photo, as gunners remain at their posts in their anti-flash gear, hundreds of men are attempting to cross over to the Destroyer Express, which had come alongside. Makeshift lines and gangplanks were put across the gap between the two ships, but as Prince of Wales rolled further to port, the gap widened and the gangplanks fell into the sea. Men continued to swing across the gap on ropes, but the situation was getting desperate now, and some men were falling to their death between the two ships. At 1:15 p.m, some 90 minutes after the first torpedo attack, the starboard beam of Prince of Wales rose up under the Destroyer Express, forcing her to pull away as the hulls ground together. The hundreds of men still left on Prince of Wales congregated at the highest points, such as the forecastle and the starboard gunwale. At 1:20, the first pair of Brewster Buffalo fighters arrived from Singapore to find the badly listing Prince of Wales in a great slick of oil. As they arrived, she went right over onto her port beam ends, crew walking down the now exposed starboard beam and jumping into the water. The battleship then went completely over until her flat bottom was exposed. Then upside down, the great bow rose into the air as she too settled by the stern and disappeared. Shortly after, 10 more Buffalo fighters arrived from Singapore. Their belated arrival brought jeers and booing from the crewmen, now in the rafts or struggling in the water. Whilst 537 crew of the Repulse had perished, 327 crew from Prince of Wales had died, almost half the number of the casualties from Repulse, and this was largely due to her modern battleship design with extensive subdivision and compartmentalisation that had kept her afloat for 90 minutes and given her crew longer to get off. The much older Repulse had sunk quickly, in 11 minutes. In all, 840 British sailors had perished in the battle, and British sea power in the Far East had been smashed. When I was taken as civilian expert in 2001 on a 2-week military expedition to dive these 2 wrecks, we spent 1 week diving each wreck. I was able to return on a number of occasions in the years that followed, and although overall I've spent several weeks diving each ship, I have not been back since the illegal salvage and desecration of these sensitive war graves started more than 10 years ago. Given that each of these wrecks has now been heavily salvaged, here is my recollection for posterity of what the wreck of HMS Repulse was like before the awful salvage started. So this is a painting I got made up after our 2001 survey for my own book, Foresaid Shipwrecks of the South China Sea. The painting was created by the marine artist I've used for all my shipwreck books, Rob Ward. As you can see, the ship lay canted over on her port beam ends in about 55 metres of water. That's about 180 feet. Much of the low port side of the ship was buried in the sand, which came up almost to the centre line of the ship around the forward and after main battery turrets. Most of the torpedo damage was on the low port side of the wreck, which was now hidden from view beneath the wreck itself. The uppermost starboard side of Repulse was pretty much intact, barring the single torpedo hole amidships in her torpedo bulge. She still displayed her elegant lines, and curiously my recollection is of thinking of her as menacing, but nevertheless a beautiful ship, sleek, fast and graceful. The starboard side of the superstructure, along with the foremast, spotting top and top hamper, was all exposed at that time. Although speaking to divers who have visited the wreck in the years after my last visit in about 2005, it is clear that in the years that followed my visits, the ship continued to capsize on the bottom, so that she moved slowly into a more inverted position. This is a phenomenon I have observed with a number of battleships over the 45 years I've been diving shipwrecks. For in the case of capsized heavy warships that have great weight in their gun turrets, superstructures, conning towers and the like, how the ship comes to rest on the seabed after the sinking is not always the way it remains. Nature will always try to equalise, and if the seabed is sandy or muddy and soft enough, If a heavy warship ends up on its beam ends on the seabed, the ship is unbalanced and gravity will cause the ship to continue to capsize slowly whilst lying on the bottom, the massive unbalanced weight driving the superstructures deeper and deeper into the seabed as the wreck attempts to achieve a fully capsized position of perfect equilibrium. I remember descending down the shot line towards the wreck on my first dive in Repulse in 2001. The visibility was perfect. I could see for 100 to 200 feet in any direction. Even though I was still far above the wreck, I could see a large percentage of the midsection of the ship lying on the bottom far below me. Divers who had already reached the wreck far below looked like tiny ants moving about the ship. The ship looked almost perfectly intact, barring the single torpedo hole in the starboard anti-torpedo bulge amidships. It seemed that if the single hole could be patched, the ship could have been raised from the seabed and would have floated. The stem and beautiful flared bow that Admiral Lord Jackie Fisher had demanded for his new battlecruisers was perfectly intact, with the tripod support for the jackstaff still in place at the prow. From here the white ensign would have flown as she went into battle for the last time. It is clearly visible in this wartime photograph. Smaller round holes near the bow, on either side, would have held the paravane chains for minesweeping. These chains went from the foredeck down either side of the bow in a loop that passed through the paravane skeg on the keel. From these chains, paravanes could be streamed on either side to essentially create an individual minesweeping capability. Just abaft the paravane hawse were situated large open chocks for mooring ropes. The anti-torpedo bulge ran from just in front of A turret all the way aft to abaft Y turret towards the stern and was very noticeable, large and rounded towards the keel but sweeping up and tapering to meet the waterline armour belt. Barring the single torpedo hole amidships, the bulge seemed intact. A single row of portholes ran along the unarmoured main deck just above the waterline armour belt, with 2 rows of portholes forward of the armour belt in the unarmoured bow area out with the box of the citadel. The starboard foremost bower anchor was still held in place snug in its hawse-pipe. Like all Royal Navy ships of World War I, Repulse originally had 3 bow anchors, a main bower anchor on either side of the hull, cabled for immediate use to an individual capstan on the foredeck, and a third sheet anchor, essentially a spare anchor, which was often smaller and of a different design to the 2 main bower anchors and did not have its own capstan. The third sheet anchor was dispensed with in the 1930s on Repulse to save weight when more armour and weaponry was added. The foredeck of Repulse was wide and long, its edges dotted with mooring bollards and the remains of guardrails. The port and starboard anchor chains emerged onto deck from their hawse pipes and ran aft along the foredeck to one of the 2 circular side-by-side capstans. Moving aft, I then came to the angled breakwater, which was several feet high. It can be seen just in front of A turret in this photo. The breakwater was designed to sweep any water flooding over the foredeck as the ship pitched and rolled, and get that water away from gun crews and over the side of the ship. To reduce freeboard, which was vulnerable to enemy fire, Repulse by design sat quite low in the water, and it was common in any sort of sea for water to sweep the foredeck.
When the sound of battle in France echoes round the world, it is well to remember that British sea power is still supreme. Symbolising the invincible might of the Royal Navy, the 32,000-ton battlecruiser Repulse carries out battle practice with 4 and 15-inch guns.
Just abaft the breakwater sat the foremost huge 15-inch gun turret called A turret. The turret was half buried in the sand, but the topmost 15-inch barrel was fully exposed above the seabed and was pointing dead ahead towards the bow. These guns would not have been used in the final battle. Just abaft A turret came the super-firing 2-gun B turret, the turret for which sat on top of a tall section of heavily armoured barbette. Unlike A turret, which had its guns trained dead ahead, the 2 barrels of B turret were swung to starboard. With most of B turret buried in the seabed, they emerged from the sand and projected upwards at an angle of about 45 degrees. In this photograph taken by the trip organiser Guy Wallace, the anchor chain in between the 2 barrels is actually the anchor chain of our own dive boat. The back of A turret is at right of shot, and you can just make out the starboard box end of the rangefinder. Although all guns were controlled centrally by a director, each individual turret was fitted with its own large horizontal optical rangefinder at the rear of the turret roof, which would allow firing under local control if central fire control was disabled. Although there were several types of rangefinder, the British favoured the Bar and Stroud coincidence rangefinder, which incorporated two prisms, one at either end of the rangefinder, with viewing eyepieces in the middle. One prism was fixed at 90 degrees and gave the operator looking through an eyepiece a true image of the target. The second prism at the other end of the rangefinder gave a second ghost image. Turning the hand wheel moved the ghost image towards the true image, and when the operator felt that both images had merged completely and were in coincidence, the target ship was properly triangulated and the range could be read off from a scale around the hand wheel. Repulse listed to port as she began to founder until she eventually capsized to port and went under. The fact that the two barrels of B turret are swung out to starboard is likely an intentional swinging out of these barrels to try and counter the port list, something seen in many sinking heavy warships, such as in this image of the Austro-Hungarian battleship Zent Istvan sinking in 1918. To get this shot, which I love, Guy went in between the two barrels of B turret and turned his back towards the front face of B turret. He then shot the image of me hanging in mid-water looking down the two barrels. Just abaft B turret, the superstructure began to step upwards, now outwards along the seabed. The top of the armoured control tower became visible. When the ship was afloat, on top of the director control tower sat a revolving chamber with a circular base that controlled the main battery guns and required a crew of 6 to man. The director layer was an overall charge with an assistant. The pointer was responsible for aiming the guns vertically, whilst the trainer was responsible for training the guns horizontally. The rangefinder operator determined the distance to the target. Data from the director was fed into a fire control table, basically an early computer, deep in the ship, which calculated aiming adjustments in elevation, bearing and fuse settings for the guns. On top of the revolving chamber was a 30-foot wide Bar and Stroud main battery coincidence rangefinder, which operated in the same principle as the version on the back of A turret described above. The revolving chamber, complete with rangefinder, had fallen to lie upside down on the seabed beside the wreck. The captain on the bridge used the optical captain's sight binoculars to select a target, and when the crew of the director control tower received an indication of the enemy target selection from the captain, the revolving top section of the tower was trained round until the target selected by the captain could be seen. This now gave the bearing to the target, and this information was sent automatically to the guns, which were all then trained on the same bearing as the director control tower. The bearing of the target was also sent to the transmitting station, the nerve centre of the ship, located deep down inside the citadel and protected by its horizontal armour decks above and by the vertical waterline armour belt along either side. Here the fire control system would perform complex calculations to take into account the ship's own speed and that of the enemy and work out the aim off, or additional training movement required to actually hit the enemy, which would have moved as the shells were in flight. The aim off solution was then sent to the guns, which were then pointed in a slightly different direction to the director control tower. The Admiralty fire control table also sent to the guns the movement and elevation of the barrels required for the range or distance to the target, as calculated by the optical rangefinders and latterly by radar. The director layer in overall charge sat in the front position of the revolving top section of the tower that now lies in the seabed, looking through a telescopic sight called the director sight at the enemy. The director trainer sat beside him. His job was to train the control tower on the target and keep it trained as the enemy target moved. As the guns became loaded and ready to be fired, individual gun-ready lamps lit up in the transmitting station. As soon as all gun-ready lamps showed ready, the transmitting station pressed a button on the Admiralty fire control table and a gong rang in the director control tower. When this was heard, the director layer pressed his firing trigger just as soon as he was on target, and all the guns were fired simultaneously by electric current. Lying in the seabed beside the revolving director control chamber was a Carley float or life raft that had been taken down with the ship when it sank. These Carley floats were made up of several watertight tubular copper sections covered in cork and then covered in canvas. They floated equally well either side uppermost. You can see Carley floats lashed to the superstructure here. The tripod tower of the foremast lay flat in the seabed. The command bridge with its large rectangular windows to front still very recognisable. Higher up the foremast, the foretop or spotting top lay flat in the seabed. On the 2001 military trip, the service personnel flew a white ensign on the foretop as a mark of respect, and this photograph is of me beside the ensign on the foretop. On an elevated platform around number 1 platform, on the starboard side of the bridge superstructure, was a single quick-firing 4-inch gun mount. With the angle the ship lay at in 2001, this gun was now just above the seabed. In this photo of the starboard side of the superstructure beneath the bridge, the 4-inch mount can be seen at bottom left. The tubular form of the superstructure accommodated ammunition hoists, which sent the quick-firing 4-inch projectile, which came as a single unit of shell and propellant cartridge, up from the magazines deep in the ship. Another Carley float life raft that went down with the ship can be seen at bottom right, yet another indication of the speed that the ship sank at. The crew had no time to cut this raft free. In this second photograph, I'm hovering with my trusty Aquazep scooter just above the starboard side of the bridge superstructure, looking at the same 4-inch barrel. Towards the rear of this large superstructure, another elevated platform held a Chicago piano 8-barrel pom-pom, seen in this photo. Again, yet another Carley float life raft has been trapped under the pom-pom mount as the ship sank. Here's another photo by Guy Wallace of that same mount, with me in it just to give some scale. Up on top of this area is the single visible torpedo impact hole on the starboard anti-torpedo bulge. Most times I dive this wreck, a lone shark seemed to have taken over this hole as its home. It was always around. Of the 2 large funnels, there was little obvious to be seen. The light steel upperworks likely crushed into the seabed and now corroded away. The seaplane hangar that latterly held the Walrus seaplane used for reconnaissance and spotting the fallen shot was still recognisable, the thin metal of the starboard side having rotted away to reveal the structural framework. Moving aft, a large gap between the main bridge superstructure and the after superstructure still held the rails for the seaplane catapult. The after superstructure was pretty intact, and out in the seabed lay the spreader for the mainmast rigging. The aftmost main battery 15-inch gun turret, called Y turret, was situated abaft the after superstructure, its barrels pointing astern. In 2001, in similar fashion to A turret, Y turret's 2 barrels were not swung out to starboard, but pointed dead astern on the centre line of the ship. Why the 2 barrels of B turret are swung out to starboard whilst A turret barrels and Y turret barrels remained on the centre line is not recorded. Perhaps power was lost to A and Y turrets but not to B turret. I suspect that the barrels of B turret were swung out to starboard under local control by the turret captain. The ship now tapered a seemingly delicate fantail. Of the 4 propellers, the 2 lower portside propellers were not visible, buried in the sand. The 2 uppermost starboard propellers, however, which were easily accessible to salvers, had been cut off at some time in the past prior to 2001 and were missing. All that remained were the struts holding the cutlass bearing and the free section of shaft running from the hull to the bearing. So that's the wreck of HMS Repulse as it was in the early 2000s. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like this video or subscribe to my channel. Fair winds and following seas.